但同时他也顾虑到可能引发的地区动荡和国际谴责，这或许是他迟迟未能做出最终决定的原因之一。
Everyone, welcome to the Asia Society and Asia Society Policy Institute's program, Iran's Future in the Middle East. We're meeting today on Tuesday, June 17th, and last Friday, on June 13th, Israel launched a series of strikes against Iran targeting its military and defense forces and its nuclear program. Since then, Israel and Iran have traded multiple missile strikes, with fatalities rising, and the most recent news, Israel asking residents of areas of Tehran to evacuate this morning. We're joined today by two world-renowned experts on the Middle East and Iran to unpack these events and discuss what they might mean for the future of the Middle East and the world. Joining us today is Vali Nasr, Professor of International Relations and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Prior to that position, he's held several distinguished positions in academia and advised the U.S. government on relations in the Middle East and South Asia. He's also written several books on Iran's grand strategy, its ambitions, and its in the sanctions regime and how it's affected the country. Interviewing him today will be Hamid Biglari, who is the Senior Partner, Chief Strategic Officer, and Chairman of the Asset Management and Financial Services at Redbird Capital Partners, a global private equity firm. Hamid has had a distinguished career in financial services, helming institutions such as Point72 Asset Management, holding senior positions at Citigroup and other institutions. Hamid is the Vice Chair of Asia Society's Board of Trustees, and Vali Nasr is one of our trustees. So we're extra delighted today to bring the senior leadership of Asia Society together for this discussion. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Hamid.
Thank you, Rory, and welcome everyone. Rory gave a setup for this discussion. I thought maybe I could add a little bit more context before we dive into the analysis with Vali. So based on the last estimates that I saw, 224 people have been killed in Iran and 24 in Israel. And also to put things in factual context, Iran's population is around 90 million and Israel's population is around 9 million. To give you context for why the Islamic Republic of Iran is viewed as an existential threat by Israel, many of Iran's hardliners, particularly on the Revolutionary Guard side of the house, which I'll refer to that as IRGC during this call, but also including the Supreme Leader, have been on the record calling for the destruction of the State of Israel. Although I should emphasize that contrary to conventional wisdom, Iran is not monolithic, and there are other political leaders, such as former President Rouhani or the former Foreign Minister and Vice President Zarif, for example, who have never used that inflammatory rhetoric. However, the point is that these extreme comments, particularly when they come from the Supreme Leader, is existential for Israel, not because of Iran's conventional military capability, but because of its ability to project nuclear weapons through ballistic missiles. And even though Iran has been under heavy sanctions, it's been able to develop both capabilities considerably. So to give you a sense of Iran's current nuclear program, it holds about 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. The reason this matters is that although uranium becomes weapons grade when it gets to 90% enrichment, going from 60 to 90% is much easier than going from 0 to 20% and then going from 20 to 60%. So to be concrete, Iran is just a matter of weeks away from having weapons grade uranium, and it has enough for up to 9 or 10 rudimentary explosive cores. And analysts estimate that it could produce 1 bomb's worth of 90% enriched uranium in about 2 weeks, and assemble a basic crude device in about 6 months. These are estimates. No one knows for sure, obviously. And finally, Iran and the U.S. have been engaged in negotiations to find a diplomatic solution where Iran's nuclear capability would be substantially curtailed in return for sanctions relief. But the negotiations never reached fruition because Iran believes it has the sovereign right to have a domestic nuclear enrichment capability, but is willing to stop short of weaponization, but that has not been acceptable to the United States because enrichment gives Iran the ability to weaponize quickly if it so chose. So that's the factual background for why Israel chose to attack. And I will now engage Vali in an analysis of where this could go. And I want to provide an upfront emphasis that while this analysis is based on informed views, at the end of the day, it's probabilistic and surprises are par for the course. So I'll frame the discussion, Vali, around the 3 key elements in the picture. First, we'll talk about Israel, then we'll talk about what could happen inside Iran, and third, we'll talk about what are the options that the United States has and where it could go. So obviously, Israel has been planning an attack like this for years, but its probability of success dramatically increased with the substantial diminution of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. So I could argue, Vali, that Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th is what set in motion the chain of events that led to Israel's unprecedented attack on Iran a few years ago. Do you agree or disagree with that? And what do you think Israel's realistic definition of victory is?
Looking back, I think, let me actually first thank Asia Society and yourself and Rory for putting this together. It's great being here and having this conversation now. I think it's correct. It's October 7th is a starting point, and largely because the scale of the attack that Israel suffered and the challenge that it posed to Israel in terms of losing its deterrence in the first months of the war, its population feeling insecure, and then the kind of anger, shock, awe, etc. that Hamas's attack and what entailed included also had a psychological change in Israel itself. I think there was a determination that grew that Israel has to do a lot more and take a lot more risk and be willing to essentially eliminate this problem once and for all. So I think that's pretty important. In fact, before October 7th, the wording among many experts was that Prime Minister Netanyahu talks a big game, but is pretty risk averse. And in fact, when the United States killed the Iranian General Soleimani, it really irked President Trump that Netanyahu was present in egging him on to do this and was involved. And the last minute, Israel did not participate in the actual operation. And so there's a psychological shift, if you will, there's a change of mindset in Israel. And that changed essentially the balance of how much Hezbollah or Hamas or Houthis would restrain Israel's willingness to take risks and do things. So I think Israel's decision was that if Hamas could kill 1,200 Israelis, abduct 200 people, humiliate the intelligence services at the beginning, that this whole thing is a much larger order of threat and Israel has to do something. But in the first year of the war, Hamid, Israel was not succeeding. I mean, the word was that the axis of resistance had it on its back heel. Israel was not getting its hostages released. It was not completely demolishing Hamas. and it was under fire from Hezbollah, from Houthis, and from other militias in the region. It is really the pager coup when they carry out that audacious decimation of Hezbollah's leadership that really the tide begins to change in an essential way.
Approximately
and I think where we are, and we can dig further because the loss of Syria, killing of Nasrallah, etc., they're all part of this. But I think Israel basically sees the war on Iran not just about Iran's nuclear program.
Silence
I think,
is awkward.
yes, that's important. Everything you said is absolutely correct.
Silence
but this is really
is
an extension and continuation of the Gaza war, even though that war hasn't finished. In other words, the rules that Israel established, that is going to finish off the axis of resistance once and for all, and the window of opportunity is there with Iran, with Trump, and that's why exactly Israel is not interested in a nuclear deal. It's not just because the nuclear deal is not 100% proof that Iran would not have weapons, but because the nuclear deal does not address the issue of Iran as a regional threat, aside from its nuclear program. And Israel wants to actually finish off Iran as an adversary. And so you have to see this war as a tail end of the Gaza war, not just because Iran is weaker and Hezbollah is not there, etc., but also because I think what Israel decided that it was going to do with the regional threats, October 8th, 9th, 10th onwards, is basically being still implemented.
To schedule more coffee chats, go to more career events, and attend all of our social activities.
You referenced
I'm
the
guessing
pager
some of
attack.
you might feel the same way. I'm so addicted to the dopamine hit I get from checking something off my to-do list that I kid you not have written make to-do list as the first item so that I can check it off immediately and feel like I got something done.
If you go to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the senior chief of Hamas, in secure IRGC apartments using concealed explosives, or the satellite-linked remote-controlled machine gun assassination of Hossein Fakhrizadeh, the so-called father of Iran's nuclear weapons program.
So naturally,
it's inconceivable to me that it could do that without having deeply penetrated the Revolutionary Guards. So what is your assessment in terms of its degree of penetration of the IRGC and whether there are factions inside IRGC that could be part of this long game or strategy of attack?
So when you have a day,
I mean, you're right. I mean, first of all, we have to start by saying Mossad is really good at this.
Your brain will run
they've always been very good at it. I mean, there's a wonderful book, New York Times journalist Roman Bergman wrote, Stand Up and Kill Them First, which is sort of the way Mossad works.
And no targeted focus.
I mean, Americans may own the technology for the Air Force, etc., that Israel has, but actually in espionage, in this kind of particularly human-level espionage, the Israelis are very, very good.
Isn't considered
downtime, and they've leveraged, if you would, that level of sophistication in order to deal with a military problem for which they didn't have a military solution. As they went to a war with Hezbollah in 2006, they couldn't defeat it. They came out of Lebanon without a victory.
It might seem that we're doing nothing.
But even the first year of the Gaza war, they didn't have a military solution for the threat that
we're developing a sense of self,
Hezbollah was posing.
And we're thinking about the perspective of others.
The coup came in the form of the pager attack, and also meticulously identifying who Hezbollah fighters are by going to funerals of those who were killed in Syria, etc., etc.
Mom's mad at me again. She thinks
Israel has had a footprint here. If we go back to before the first nuclear deal, when there was a massive cyber attack on Iran's nuclear program called Stuxnet. I mean, Israelis had somebody who took a USB into Iran's most secure nuclear facilities and loaded the worm onto the machines that caused crashes of cascades of centrifuges.
Did anyone catch what happened?
I think Iran found out.
I was able to find where my mom's shirt was without
Hezbollah was
for it.
decimated when Hania was killed, that it has a huge security problem, that it has been infiltrated.
For example,
but plugging that hole takes time.
That led to 20%
in fact, that's part of the reason that Israel is in a hurry
while getting a haircut.
to basically finish what it wants to finish in Iran militarily, because that window could potentially close. So what they've invested massively, they want to leverage. And although I would say that the killing of the 5 or 6 commanders that happened a few weeks ago is not just an intelligence coup. It's that it was a misunderstanding or miscalculation by Iran, that they trusted that when Trump said that there would not be a military solution until the talks failed. So their expectation was that there would not be a military attack, and they don't need to hide in bunkers until they met in Sunday in Qatar and heard from the in Oman, and heard from Americans whether there was a way forward or not. So partly there was a surprise here that this attack came before the last round of the talks, and it caught them off guard. But I have to say, since then, and this is important to note, the way in which IRGC has reacted is also surprised Israel. Because if in any military, if you decimated the top 5 commanders that run the 5 main branches of a military organization, you don't expect them to be able to launch a coherent military response the next day. So the IRGC has not collapsed the way Hezbollah has. It's still fighting the war, and so in that sense, I think there are limits to what the intelligence has achieved so far.
It might feel a little awkward at first, but I promise it'll be worth it.
Probe 2 other dimensions regarding Iran.
One
is that Israel has been pursuing a balancing act.
I'll get up and take a stroll. My boyfriend loves to clean, which is a win for me, but he also does great
Iran's
thinking
leadership, but is not at war with the people of Iran, and is very careful to continue to make that distinction, including the label that it's using for this attack, which is rising lion.
With literally doing nothing, experts also recommend mindless
How
tasks
far
like
do you think
vacuuming, organizing, or
that
even
balancing
doodling.
act can go?
Just remember that downtime is
Given
only downtime when there's no specific goal
increasingly
and no
high
specific
level of
target
strikes
attention.
into Tehran, which is inevitably going to
You're way too busy for downtime.
The Iranian population. It's actually broader than Tehran, as you know, it's across the entire country.
Well, it's those of us that are busiest that need downtime the most.
Is there a risk that they're running that at some point people would say this is an attack against the integrity of the country, and as much as they may disagree or
is an essential process for our brain, but it's also something we can practice and develop.
Have animosity towards the regime?
As children, we were masters
protecting the sovereignty of the country comes first, and it actually results in a
my childhood was a kaleidoscope of fantasy
coming
and adventure
together behind the regime. How is it thinking about that balance?
Contemplating why
I think the Israelis are far too sophisticated and far too knowledgeable to buy into the regime change rhetoric that they're putting out. I think this is a lot of it is very, very sophisticated war propaganda. It's often understood. We are with the people. We are after the regime.
Downtime
we're going to help liberate you. You should rise up, etc. If it happens, it's great. But I don't think the Israeli war cabinet was putting any stock on a popular uprising. I think the way this campaign is being waged, and again, as you said, it has been thought of for a long time, is actually to degrade the Iranian state. So the attack very early on came against nuclear sites and against military leadership, which was supposed to be able to conduct the war. And then it began to go after the various organs and institutions of the state, from the radio, television, to refineries, electrical facilities, and even very early on, it did hit civilian targets, because even some of the generals who were assassinated were killed in their homes, and they lived in high rises, and these were hit. And then
I think they've proceeded, including with this threatening Tehran, ordering evacuation, which was then
you've got a job
reiterated by President Trump. Although Tehran does not have military targets inside of it, so it's no logic to say get out because we need to hit. It's largely to create enough mayhem, enough anxiety that actually would make Iran, and particularly Tehran, ungovernable, would overwhelm the institutions of the state. And it's basically they're looking not for regime change, they're looking for regime collapse, if you would. And to make it such that the Islamic Republic cannot coherently govern the country. Now, the more Islamic, the IRGC has shown resilience and targeted Israel, it has also forced Israel to double down on this strategy.
And so regardless of the ingredients,
right? So Israel has hit what it can on the nuclear facilities.
And that's what I want from you.
So there's nothing more to hit. It has the run of the skies. Where it wants to hit, which is the deeply embedded nuclear areas, it cannot do on its own. It needs American support, which is a topic we will talk about. So now it's really focused on forcing a collapse of the Islamic Republic. And I think the population is right now, the population is terrorized. Basically, around the country because they feel that they're defenseless, and all of a sudden they're caught in a war they didn't expect. They don't know where to go. It's business, all their businesses, etc., is under threat. The number of casualties is not high, but there are some things that also Israeli officials have said that scare them. For instance, Israeli defense minister said that we're going to apply the rules of South Beirut, Dahia, to Tehran. Or the rules of Gaza to Tehran, which is the same, which basically means that you're governed by an undesirable terrorist force, let's say, Hamas, Hezbollah. In Israeli minds, Islamic Republic is in the same category, but the targeting them will go through the civilians, and the civilians will pay the price. So I think the priority of the public is not regime change.
The goal of a negotiation
is to first of all, there is no regime to change to. What do you change to? Who to? What happens day after?
What a good deal is.
Who's actually going to be running the police, the water, the electricity the day after?
At least 3 pieces of
there's nothing there.
The first thing we need to know is
coherence
what is
that
our
the
alternative?
Opposition had 2-3 years ago around the Mahsa Amini protest is actually fractured. You can see some people are still being full that the regime is under attack. There are those who are rallying to the flag.
Secondly,
they're making a distinction between patriotism and the country versus the Islamic Republic. But the priority of the population right now is not regime change, because regime change doesn't address the terror that they're facing.
Because that's the point.
And I think I think the longer this goes, Israel's priority would be to knock Iran out.
And one that
as quickly from the fighting as before, and then the civilians basically become. Or whether they like Israel, they don't like Israel, they want to be democratic or not, will become an afterthought. It become irrelevant to the war campaign.
Let me explore that concept of regime change a little further. I think you and I can agree that regime change from outside of the country is not serious. Any change, if there is going to be change in regime, or structure, it will have to happen inside the country.
And I think
we would both agree that the opposition outside the structure of the government is also highly fractured. That only leaves one other potential avenue for regime change. And that is if a faction within the IRGC decides that things are going so far that the integrity of the country is at risk and decide to take matters into their own hands, mount a coup, and explore the idea of giving in on some of the issues, including the nuclear capability, in return for cessation of hostilities. What probability would you assign to that kind of an outcome or evolution?
I think much more probability than the idea of regime change as we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, we also have to remember that
And
in those cases, there was presence of U.S. troops and tanks in the streets to actually install a new government. And that does not exist in Iran right now. If it comes to a situation where the United States invades Iran and arrives in Tehran, and then it can basically install a government over there. Even the last time this happened in Iran at World War II, Allied forces invaded Iran, removed the king at the time, and put his son in its place.
Because when you negotiate issue by issue,
this is not going to happen right now. Secondly, the opposition outside, as well as some opposition leaders who are in prison inside of Iran, they don't have a ground game. The opposition outside are very influential as influencers. Influencers of public opinion, but they're not in a position to actually not only change the government, but actually run the country. And an example very recently of Syria, where this HTS and Ahmad al-Shara took over, this was a force of 30,000 fighters, which occupied a part of Syria and then invaded the rest of Syria. That also doesn't exist in the case of Iran, that you would say there are 30,000 troops under a leader is sitting in some corner of Iran and is going to invade. So the most likely scenario is that either under military pressure or because the supreme leader dies under whatever circumstance, or there is an internal battle, that you have an opening for a shift within the regime itself. And I think the closest I can give, when people may remember, is that when there was a sort of a battle for power after Gorbachev's death and Yeltsin, who now we think of him as a kind of a Democrat who changed Russia, but let's not forget, he was the mayor of Leningrad. He was a very high-level official of the state, basically directed the Soviet Union and Russia in a completely different direction for a Deng Xiaoping in China.
What was in his interest?
That possibility is there.
But to make sure the provost was happy.
I mean, the possibility of a military coup by IRGC, if things begin to really get out of control, there is chaos, there is war, there's a situation of national emergency that justifies putting the Constitution aside and taking over, imposing martial law on the country, etc. That's the highest probability. But then the question is, would it be a much more hardline, ultra-nationalist coup of people who want to fight it out, double down, take a nuclear program underground?
And it did turn out to be true.
Or it would be, as you said, a group which are more pragmatic and would basically say that, look, the game that we played all these years, our foreign policy, our national strategy is at its end, and we need to go down a different path.
Changed the credit to match the contact
and all of this depends on what happens. In other words,
why not change the contact
we're not at
hours
that point.
Because it turns out that
and how the war ends. And I have to say this, it also greatly depends on what's on the table.
So while they were 3 hours, it was
reaching out to the West, pragmatics winning a struggle of power in Iran will not happen in a vacuum. You have to have a deal by President Trump on the table.
He said to me,
that
I never even thought
ultimately
of that.
Majority of Iranians would rally to and provide support and demand it of the government.
Because he didn't have
and those who are sticking their neck out with pragmatism would see that it actually would pay dividends. So just threatening war and demanding surrender from Iran is not going to encourage moderates to win.
See, you gave two scenarios. One, which is the ultra-nationalists take over and take the development of a weapon underground, and the second one is they reach a deal. I discount the first probability because to me that's just a continuation of the existing reason for war. And if anything, I think Israel and the United States will double down in that scenario to further escalate. It's not resolving anything. The only resolution that I see is if there is a direction change, essentially a
the U.S. Tennis Open's Grand Slam tournament. Got some new technology.
Declaration
and for the first time,
surrender
they were able to replay
by switching direction
and so they allowed the players to challenge
further
the referees.
to enhance their survivability. Would you disagree with that?
Over the course of the entire tournament,
no, I mean, it's a question of timing. You're correct. I mean, doubling down in the long term does not
given
work.
To the player.
But realistically, if President Trump is asking for surrender now, it could be an argument among some, and particularly you have to see the mindset of the people who take over.
It turns out the men challenged
that would say, well, if he's offering surrender, we may as well fight it out.
Now we can come up with
and maybe there's another option down
about
there.
Why men's tennis is different from women's
and therefore, I think that's what I mean. That how Trump approaches
maybe
this
the judges are paying more
is very
attention to the
key.
women.
That let's say this very first coup that happens, which way does it go? Does it double down, which ends up in a war with the United States down the road?
Right.
Or does it actually, there is an opening for a strong argument that you have to make a deal. There is a third option, which is also possible, which is that if the war continues, let's say for a bit, and there is a regime collapse, in other words, you really have what we're seeing, it is possible to think that that might mean more going in the direction of a Syria or a Libya.
When they were told
there is enough,
that people
if you
like
would,
them negotiate
although most Iranians don't want to think that that's possible.
Better
but there are parts of Iran that have been enamored with separatism in Azerbaijan, Baluchistan, Kurdistan.
If you change your
there is a sufficient amount of economic pain and pressure, class difference between the poor and the rich. That if really you lose the capability to govern Iran, it is possible that there might be much more civil strife. And I don't want to say complete chaos.
Let's first
but
talk about
you actually don't end up with a government that actually can make the decisions that you say.
That women are much more
nobody is strong enough to actually make those kinds of decisions
when they pair their competence.
So let me switch to, if you're the United States, how should you think about this? So yesterday I read that Netanyahu had made a statement that Israel had set Iran's nuclear capability back significantly. But that seems to me to be more rhetoric than reality.
Can you help me figure out how to leverage this
And let me just contextualize why I believe that, so that at least the audience, I know you know this, but at least the audience has a better sense of this.
We can do this.
So Iran has two major industrial strength enrichment sites. One is at Natanz and the other one is at Fordo. Natanz is primarily above ground. Fordo is primarily underground. The main enrichment centrifuges of the country is in Fordo. And just so you understand what underground means, it's buried around 80 or 90 meters below the mountain.
More than that. I think we're down probably some of it half a mile.
She was saying, can you
I think it starts at 80 or 90 meters and then goes further down. There are layers of rock and reinforced concrete. There are protective tunnels well inside the mountain surface. And the only weapon on Earth that can penetrate that is a weapon system called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or GBU-57, which has a load of 30,000 pounds and can penetrate 60 meters in a single strike. So to get at Iran's centrifuge capability in Fordo requires several GBU-57 strikes, the first to create the initial hole and the others to penetrate further to destroy the site. And there are only two aircrafts in the world that can deliver that. They're both stealth aircrafts. One is the B-2 Spirit and the other one is the B-21 Raider bomber. And they can't sit on aircraft carriers. The closest one to Iran is in the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, which is thousands of miles away from Fordo. So to really finish off Iran's nuclear capability, requires fundamentally the U.S. to get directly involved, which is essentially a declaration of war between the United States and Iran. Now, that goes counter to everything Trump and the MAGA movement believes in, which is not to get the U.S. involved in a distant war. So when Trump threatens Iran with that, and given that this is so counter to everything that he stood for and the MAGA movement stood for, and we know that he really does care about what the MAGA movement thinks about all this, how do you think, first of all, how realistic a threat is that, and how do you think the people in Iran are reacting to those kinds of threats?
But the consultant that the client
I think it's a very good point.
wanted that project as well.
I think before the attacks happened,
what if we
there
hired
was more
a
of a sense
to work underneath her and give her
that
the
the MAGA
opportunity to work on
mentality
both
was
projects
dominating.
with that leverage.
That Trump didn't want war. Yes, he would say if diplomacy fails, I would have to do it. But that he wasn't going to do it. And there was also reading of the tea leaves, like he let go of his national security advisor, and then the new Secretary of State / National Security Advisor Marco Rubio fired a number of neocon lower-level people. There were very loud voices in the MAGA movement: Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, etc., which are all of whom are very anti-war.
Find out your market value.
And then there was the example of Yemen, that he allowed a war start and then he pulled the plug on it when he wasn't getting the results that he wanted. But then, the question is, how does Iran interpret the Israeli attack? So one theory is to say Trump can say anything he wants, but the decisions are made in Jerusalem, not in Washington.
One of the other things
basically
you can do
Bibi, and in
is
fact,
to survey a membership
foreign
group
minister,
or
I
an
was on the
association,
program,
either online
he was talking,
or offline,
he said, well,
and
we
ask
decided
those
the talks
what
have
their
failed.
salary range
I thought that was a really interesting comment. In other words, they're not even at the table. But he basically said, we made the decision that these talks are not going anywhere and we're going to pull the plug. So if that's the case, then the Iranians may conclude that everything we say about MAGA, Trump, etc., is immaterial. This decision is driven by Bibi, and Bibi can control
He said, you've
Trump.
got to go back
The second argument is that Trump actually never meant to negotiate
that I might lose that job.
That this was all a ruse, and all along he had a deal that this would happen. And now they can look back and say that's true. There were 5 rounds of talks. The first 2, the U.S. was not even ready to talk. It didn't have the personnel. Witkoff just showed up. When the Iranians gave him a proposal in the first meeting, he said, I'm not ready for a proposal. This is just a get-to-know-you meeting. And then, he didn't want to do sustained talking. He wanted to come, meet for half a day, leave, and then leave it to the Omanis to do things. And then they got stuck on basically this enrichment issue, which was only one element in what a deal ought to be. They never actually negotiated about substance. And even before they got there, then
if you decide
it pulled the plug. So you could say that he never even meant to negotiate.
You need to be strategic.
And the third argument is that he just decided to try to use an Israeli strike to soften Iran up, and he might have lost control now. That he thought that they would bomb a few places, they would kill a few people, and then the Iranians would come on their knees and sign whatever he dictates.
And sometimes when you say no,
I think it's very difficult to read what the true Trump is, because having started this is extremely difficult.
But you'll never know that unless you're willing to walk
if Trump
away.
Really, the key question, and I think where Iran is, Iran's only leverage is to force Trump to face war.
And
because otherwise Trump expects surrender from Iran.
Really worked for me and allowed me to
so the only way that they can deal with him is to say that if you think you're crazy, we're crazier than you.
I had no idea
we're willing to risk an all-out war. Are you ready to invade with tens of thousands of troops and get bogged down in the Middle East? If you're not, then as Iran's foreign minister has said, you have to get Israel to stop and then negotiate properly about a nuclear deal.
You really do have to understand.
So there is already, if you want, pre-negotiation through intermediaries,
if you don't know what you want,
and through the press that's going back and forth.
Earlier in my career,
neither Iran
I
nor
realized
America
that
closed the door to
projects I was going to get to work on
but
and the people I was going to get to work with
if
would
there
be
is a
invaluable
deal, Trump cannot
for me
bomb
to gain for later on. So
he has
when I
to stop
received a
there.
promotion, I took
And then he has
that
to
time
find a
not
way to
just to
control
negotiate my cash compensation,
Bibi.
but my total
And I find what
package.
Bibi said
In
extremely
this way,
interesting.
I was able
It's
to
almost
ensure
like he's
that I was
preparing
able to focus
a
on
way
a particular
to claim
industry
victory,
and also get to work
short
with
of
team members
destruction
who
of
I knew
Fardo.
would invest in my
To
own
say that,
development.
we've achieved a lot, because
When
it's
I
really
was
up to him
hiring
to
people,
say
it struck
Iran
me
is now, he keeps saying
that
Iran is 6
men
months from a bomb. He can now say they're
quite
2 years from a
frequently,
bomb. I mean, he
and
can
women were
change
not
the narrative.
negotiating.
If
And
Trump
when they
is
did
not
negotiate,
goes and bombs
women would have a
Fardo,
number
it is still
in their
possible
mind
that
of
he
what they
thinks that
wanted,
Iranians will
but
be
they
forced to
wouldn't be able
negotiate
back
after
into how
Fardo
they
is
got
gone.
that. They didn't
But then the
explain to me
scenarios
that
could
they
be
did a
very, very
competitive assessment.
complicated. The
They
Iranians
didn't
may
tie
at
it
that
to the
point
results and
retaliate,
goals that I was
either
hiring them
against
for,
the
and
United
why,
States
based on their
directly,
experience,
bases
they were
around
a
the
perfect
region,
fit,
go after the
and they were
world
going
oil
to meet
market,
those goals
put
for
mines
me,
into the
and
Straits of
therefore,
Hormuz,
they wanted a
basically
package that would
try
include
to
X.
force the
They
United
needed to come
States
in prepared and just persuade
hand
me
on
that
war,
they could meet my
or that they
needs.
basically would say, you know
I've been
what, we're
on
going to
both
come out of
sides of the
NPT, we're going to
negotiation,
rebuild
first running
something like
compensation
Fardo,
for
we're
a
going to
large
kick out all the
organization, and now as I
IAEA
place people in
inspectors,
jobs,
and we're
where
going to
I've seen
rebuild the
women be
program
most
and accelerate
successful is when they
directly
frame their
to
ask in terms of how it
build
reaches the
a
business goals.
weapon.
So
And here's
no
something
ask,
which is
just
interesting,
always
because
keep in
everybody's
mind
been
how does
talking
it help
about
the company as
enrichment.
well.
But
What I've
according to
noticed
Bibi
before is
Netanyahu,
candidates
and I take
negotiate
him at
their
his word,
compensation
Iran
package
has
is
enough
that sometimes
enriched
the
material for
negotiation
9
process can
bombs.
get so heated and both parties
Now,
can
I
get
don't know
so
whether that's
focused on what
60%
they're
or
looking to
90%
get out of
that
it,
in other words, he
that
says
the
they can basically
candidate's
build the bomb.
enthusiasm
So
and
Iran
hunger
can
for the
build
job
9
can get
bombs
lost.
as we're speaking
Therefore,
without having
remember
Fardo
when
and
you enter
Natanz.
this
If you
process
take
that you want your future
Netanyahu at his
employer
word.
and your boss to
He
know
says we
that
haven't
you're not only
bombed those
excited about
enriched
the
uranium because
opportunity,
we may
but you're
cause,
hungry to get in
it
there
may
and start the
cause
job.
Let's start with
radioactive
baby steps.
dissemination.
Don't start
But
off with
it's
a
also possible
negotiation
they
where
don't
there's
know
a
where
big
those are.
relationship risk. Rather,
And so then if
start a
Iran goes
negotiation
dark and you
where the
don't have a deal with
relationship is
it,
possibly
then
not
the
even
U.S. is going
important,
to be put in a position
where
again
there's
that the
less
only way
risks
to
to you
ensure that Iran is not
to
building a bomb is actually to
experiment,
invade Iran
try.
and try to do what they tried to do in Iraq. So bombing Fardo, yes, there's a scenario in which you bomb Fardo, you kill the supreme leader, the whole thing collapses, and you're done with it. But if you bomb and the regime survives, then Trump will have a more difficult set of options before it.
Think about going to a
And
department
now
store.
pulling a deal
And I don't know
out of
about
the
you,
hat
but I
without
am a shoeaholic.
Fardo
I love
being
shoes.
bombed,
Unfortunately,
it
with my
requires
job,
really to see
I
how
spend
good
a
a
lot of
deal
time
maker
in
is.
boring black
This
pumps.
really requires him to
sometimes when I
manage
go
the
to shoe
Iranians in a
sales,
way that
there
brings
are
them to the
shoes
table
that
and
sing
manage
to you.
Israelis as well.
You can't wear
And it's
them.
not
You can't
easily
even
done.
walk
I think
very far in them.
if
But
he
when you put
really
them on,
allowed
you're
this
like,
attack to happen as just to get a leverage
So
against the Iranians, he
I go
may
to
have
this department store.
miscalculated because the situation has
it's the
become
sale.
more
They
complicated.
have a sale like once every 6 months. I'm there when the store opens.
If you
And I
play
find
out
boring
this
pair of
scenario,
pumps that I'm going to have to buy. And then there's a shoe that from the rack.
just as much as the current situation may be existential for Israel,
And they were in my size.
if it gets to the point where the situation is existential for
These were really
the
expensive shoes, and they
regime,
hadn't discounted them very much.
what is there
And I said to
preventing
the
it
guy,
from
I said, I'm gonna
going
buy
after
these shoes
shipping
here.
in the Persian Gulf?
These are beautiful.
And let's
I
assume
want
that
them,
it does fall
they're too expensive.
along the lines
Can
that
you
you
help me?
initially outlined.
And he said,
This will
no
be
problem, ma'am. Here's what you do.
Iraq and
Buy all
Syria
4 pairs.
on steroids, on Libya
But
on
don't
steroids,
wear
if Iran
these
were
shoes.
to disintegrate.
And then bring them back
And
in a
the
week.
calamity that
You
would
return
occur in the
them, we
region
discount 50%, and then you can come and
is
buy them back
uncontrollable for the
And I said,
world's
it's an hour and a half
energy
each
markets,
way
given
from
the
my
importance
home
of Iran
to the store.
and the region
It's not gonna
for
happen.
that.
Have you got any other options?
So
And he
from
said,
the
"Let me go
point of
talk to
view
my manager."
of a decision
But when he
maker
came
and a
back, he
policy
said,
maker
we'll take
doing game
$75 off
theory
those shoes for you.
across
And I
this,
said, that works.
what is
Now, here's your assignment.
if you were in that situation,
favorite
obviously,
department store.
this is a dynamic situation.
something you
It could unfold in
And
different
then
ways.
Negotiate.
What is the least bad
Figure out
outcome?
how to solve the problem. Here's what
But
I
look,
want.
I think what you put your finger on is
It's too
very
expensive
important.
for
It's
me.
also very important not to think of game
ask
theory
for
based on
help.
assumptions that
Initiate
an
the
American would
negotiation.
make or a European would make.
Not all
You see,
of
there is
will
a
be
scenario in
successful.
which if the leaders
Every
of Iran
time.
today, and they
But
don't
you will be surprised
distinguish between the state and the regime. This is an outside of Iran kind of looking at it. They see themselves as defender of the country. And if they think that the survival of the country is at stake,
And with Maggie's work,
then they may also do crazy things. It brings to mind when France invaded Russia in the previous century, and the Russians actually set the entire city of Moscow on fire.
You need to practice
and retreated into the woods.
You need to learn.
I mean, the French were completely shocked that that would happen.
You need to see social situations
so
as an opportunity to create
if you have people in Iran who basically decide
and your counterparts can
the
get more
best bet for survival of the country is actually to force the Americans to fight on the ground. They cannot fight the Americans and Israelis in the air. That option isn't there, right? So if you don't have that option, and it's between handing the keys of the country to them, and you don't trust them to be good guardians when you give the keys to them, and you basically say that this is a big country. I mean, it's not only, I mean, we have to also note that the closest port to Tehran is about 2,000 miles from, and 2 mountain ranges from the capital city. I mean, to invade and control Iran requires order of magnitude larger number of troops than the US deployed in Iraq. It would be hugely costly, it would be hugely problematic. But you might very well say that that might be, they may decide that you have to confront the United States with that reality before you get it to make a decision that you can live with. And that's a very dangerous calculation. I think we have to think not only in terms of the options that are palatable, like the regime's going to fall, they're going to make a rational decision, they're going to just shelve their nuclear program. So I think still the least bad option is a deal that would stop the fighting now, which would, yes, it's short of Israel's war aims, but it's far better than what Israel was facing a week ago in terms of Iran's nuclear program, in terms of the strength of the Islamic Republic. And it would be still the best outcome for the United States, because if President Trump, not only that he doesn't like war, he wants to focus on China, he wants to focus on the border, he wants to deploy the Marines instead of in the Middle East, in American cities. If all of these things you put together, it's also the least bad option for him.
Right. So we've talked about the three main protagonists in this complicated situation.
And I want to try to
Where do you think Russia and China land, given the fact that Russia has more than its arms full dealing with Ukraine, and its ability to project any influence is extremely limited, and China is far away? How do you think they're looking at this and what their calculus is?
To think a lot about what they're going to say.
I think they're worried, but also they are watching. I mean, there's a number of things at play. They're looking at U.S. behavior, how U.S. handles something like this, because it does have implications with how it would handle issues with them. They're looking at whether Iran will become like 9/11, something that can distract the United States for a time period. And divert attention from them.
First by telling a little bit about the actual.
I mean, there are already some reports unconfirmed that the Chinese may be supplying certain things to Iran.
And then I'd like to talk with you about how you can
not at a scale that we might, but in ways that could address some of what Iran needs. But I don't think the Russians and the Chinese will get involved in this in a way that puts them in the crosshairs of the U.S. But I don't think either Russia or China will benefit from Iran disappearing from the current equation. I mean, the Russians need Iran, not just because of drones, etc., but they need Iran for trade, as strategic depth. Last thing they want is the United States or Europeans to be sitting in Tehran and running the show from there as well. And the Chinese also have looked at Iran as important for the whole Eurasian concept that they have. And yes, they're not going to risk saving Iran, but I think they might still provide certain assistance to Iran just to keep Iran afloat and keep it going. This might also be financial. It might be varieties of things that are non-lethal. And then it really depends on how this ends. I mean, if Trump is actually able to pull a rabbit out of the hat, it does impact his global standing. If on the other hand he gets bogged down in a war, or it looks like he's being basically managed from by Bibi Netanyahu, that also has implications for how much he can do. So it's one of those cases where it doesn't have a direct bearing on bilateral relations there, but it is not insignificant or irrelevant to the whole, to how these things, how those relations might unfold.
About how your body language can.
Now, Israel has thus far stopped short of going after Iran's political leadership. Its targets so far have been military leaders and control centers.
Psychologically and from a body language perspective, is that you're going to be closing yourself off a little bit to other people. You're privileging
because obviously
your knowledge and experience
they have the ability to, through their
you're becoming
internal
more directive and more
sources to figure out where to go if they wanted to.
Than from taking direction.
What do you think would be the catalyst where that calculus could change?
Show up approachable.
Well, there's two elements to the civilian side. So one is that they don't need to kill ministers or the president in Iran. But they can destroy ministries and organizations that actually run things. So when they destroyed Iran's national television, yes, it's symbolic, but it actually is an organ that's run by the government, and it provides, if you would, a state function. So if they begin to target ministries, and today, for instance, there was a hack that wiped out a huge amount of money out of a bank. So these are for this kind of civilian attack, you don't need to kill figures. You need to kill institutions, right? And they have started doing that. There is only one political figure here that matters, which is the head of state.
Yeah.
And that's a risky thing to do, because it may also unleash a sort of a much more uncontrolled Iranian response.
So in the framework that I'm introducing to you today, which I call acting with power,
and it also, I think if you're President Trump, President Trump said, I vetoed it.
And the body language is
so there's two reasons why you would veto it, why he would say that. One is he's just trying to get brownie points with Iranians, play the good cop, and say, I'm not with Israel. I did something positive for you. You could still talk to me. The second is that Trump also understands that if you're going to cut a deal with Iran, you have to have somebody who has the authority to actually cut a deal with you.
When you look at
you remove the supreme leader, there's nobody in Iran who you can negotiate with.
What you'll see is a general body language that reflects
a state of relaxation. The deal that would stay would have to be a deal with the head of state in Iran, somebody who can deliver on that deal, who can keep the Revolutionary Guards in control. And I don't think they're at the stage that they think that the supreme leader would not do that.
Will look like
and so there is certain usefulness to him not being killed.
Body.
Because
when walking, you assume others will move out of your path.
Things could become a lot more difficult.
Maximum space.
Now,
and allowing
I don't know even after as time goes on whether Israel might even know where he is.
Other actions.
The more time the Iranians have to fix the problem of being identified as to where they are,
and
the more difficult this will become. It doesn't mean that they can't ever find out.
To have long sentences, in fact, they can be very short.
He may not be as accessible as he was in the first 24 hours, let's say.
And
that's partly seen because the Israelis are not able to kill the new commanders of IRGC. They are killing commanders, but not the way that they kill specific heads of divisions that they did in the first
that staring someone down is associated with playing high is something
Let me just ask one more question in the last 5 minutes that we have.
So when you're playing high,
how do you think
you stare someone down?
They're not a prominent player in this. They're secondary players.
They know you're serious.
But how do you think the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Pakistanis, the countries surrounding Iran are viewing this, and what is the outcome that they're expecting?
Other people's eyes for any reaction.
It's actually very interesting. Pakistan and Turkey,
and you have no visible reaction,
even among their highest level politicians, have reacted very, very interestingly.
Before you know what you're going to say.
Which is after Iran, it will be Arthur.
It's important to recognize that.
So they've not seen this about Iran. They've seen this about as a geostrategic shift. That if Israel is able to take care of nuclear threats as far as wide as it wants to go, or take care of adversaries at will. Iran is right now the bogey in front of it, but what happens when Iran is gone? Who's the next bogey? And it's very funny, so they're all standing up saying, I think I'm going to be the next bogey. I think I'm going to be the next bogey. And that's a sort of one reaction.
Your actual rank,
the other is that the Gulf countries are very nervous because a prolonged conflict could actually land on their doorsteps. Apparently, when President Trump was in the Gulf, he was told by all three leaders there are trillions of dollars of business we can do together. The economic development promise here is enormous, but you cannot have a war. That we can build a $10 billion data center here that can be destroyed by a $25,000 drone.
And tight. They try to make themselves
and if the United States is going to prevent that, it has to be in the Gulf in much larger numbers, unless there is some kind of a de-escalation with the U.S., and that's why these Gulf countries were all supporting a nuclear deal.
Attempt to shrink
and I'm sure that what they're basically telling President Trump is that war is not a good idea.
So when someone's playing low, you'll see them
it just depends on how much he's listening to them.
Inward. It's all different ways
and very clearly that some of these Arab countries are engaged in this messaging right now that we're hearing, like what Iranians are saying, what Trump is saying. This is being relayed through these countries.
Talking with your hands near your face,
well,
and instead of looking directly at someone, a lot more glancing around and looking away. They'll talk to you
all the complexities associated with this situation. Anyone who tuned in expecting there would be answers thought incorrectly. There are no answers. These are dilemmas with horns, and there are no silver bullet solutions to them. They can go in unpredictable ways, and I've always felt that if we lived in a world that had a bell-shaped distribution 20 years ago, we're increasingly living in a world with fat-tailed outcomes where things that we thought were improbable, such as regime change in Iran, attacks in the Persian Gulf, regime collapse, things that were unfathomable are now in the realm of possibility. And I don't know about you, but I was surprised by the Israeli attack on Friday. I didn't expect that it would have happened this quickly when we're in the midst of negotiation, but that's what surprise is. You don't have surprise when people expect it, you have surprise when no one expects it.
So you're most likely to be effective.
I don't think either of us have a sense of where this could go, but I think what we've tried to lay out is all the various directions that it could go, and we hope for the least unattractive outcome, because there are no good outcomes from this. So thank you so much.
To make myself more
comfortable. Thanks for having me.
In situations where I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to show up the way I want to. And I also use my body language to help